Welcome to the Manly Saints Project with me, Hugh Hunter. We live in a world that struggles to understand the virtue of manliness. Our culture doesn't provide young men, or any men for that matter, with a lot of positive male role models. But our Christian tradition can provide such role models. The stories of the saints provide example after example of manly virtue. Telling these stories is what the Manly Saints Project is all about. If you enjoy my work, please consider signing up and supporting me on Substack, or click the link in the show notes to buy me a beer. And if you enjoy the podcast as audio or video, please consider giving me a rating wherever you are. It helps a lot. Now, let's meet this week's Manly Saint. Join me today to meet a blessed who redeemed the legacy of his father. Name: Adolf IV, Count of Schauenberg and Holstein, brother Adolf. Life: around 1200 to 1261 AD. Status: blessed. Feast: July 8th. In the year 1238 AD, Count Adolf IV of Schauenberg and Holstein took the Crusader oath, committing himself to travel away from his lands in the north of modern Germany. Adolf, however, wasn't going south to the Holy Land. He was going northeast, up the coast of the Baltic Sea. Adolf would fight in the long, frozen wars we remember as the Northern Crusades. The Northern Crusades were one of the many crusades ongoing in Adolf's day. Most famously, of course, Christians had gone to war in the Holy Land to protect the holy places lost in the initial expansion of Islam. That same expansion had swallowed up most of Spain, and Spanish knights crusaded there to regain their homeland. The resurgence of the ancient heresy of Gnosticism among the Cathars of southern France provoked the Albigensian Crusade. Only a few decades before that, a different crusade had begun in the north. Count Adolf's Holy Roman Empire stretched north to the border with Denmark and east to Poland. But to the northeast, along the east coast of the Baltic Sea, were the pagan lands of modern Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania. These places mattered because, as everyone knew, if you went much further north from there, you got to the strange places where the green men lived, and where children were born with dogs' heads instead of those of humans. But Livonia, as Estonia and the north of Latvia were then known, was southerly enough for civilization, and for Christianity. A bishop had set up a church in Riga, in modern Latvia, but his flock was subject to constant raids. If his flock was under attack, the bishop decided that he needed to find some sheepdogs. He looked to the examples of the military orders, fighting monks who were proving efficacious in the other crusades. In Palestine, the Knights Templar, Knights Hospitaller, and the new Teutonic Knights were holding back the forces of Islam. In Spain, St. Raymond of Fitero's Knights of Calatrava and others held the dangerous borderlands. And so, the Bishop of Riga had founded the Brothers of the Knighthood of Christ in Livonia, the Livonian Sword Brothers, as we remember them today. They were warrior monks, taking vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and devoting their lives to fighting for Christendom. Using the western Dvina River, they pushed into the heartland of Livonia, marked out by their white cloaks and the symbols of a small red cross over a sword. For a while, things had gone well, but by the time Count Adolf arrived, it had all fallen apart. History does not record anything about Adolf's crusade. But if we consider Adolf's life up to that point, we can conclude that his help on the northern frontier must have been welcome indeed. Adolf IV was the eldest son of Adolf III, the tragic Count of Schauenberg and Holstein. Adolf III had been an important man in the Holy Roman Empire, and his power had come largely from his control over Holstein in the northern tip of modern Germany. Adolf III had played the dynastic games along with all the other nobles, and for a while he backed the right figures, switching his allegiance to Frederick II Barbarossa at a good moment. Adolf had followed his emperor on crusade to the Holy Land, but they had barely arrived when Adolf had to deal with a crisis at home, his crusading vow still unfulfilled. That meant Adolf had not been there when Frederick Barbarossa died in a bizarre accident, and his army fell apart. A few lost German knights drifting to the hospital of Our Lady in Acre, modern Akko, forming the brotherhood that would grow into the Teutonic Order. Adolf, having missed it all, would hurry back to take part in the lackluster crusade led by Frederick's son. At home, Adolf III had helped his people. He was especially remembered for his generosity to some traders who had set up along the river Alsta, endowing them with rights and privileges that allowed them to grow their settlement into the small city of Hamburg. But Adolf's rule would be as ill-fated as his crusading. The power of Denmark was growing in the north. Soon, Adolf would face King Valdemar II, the Conqueror. The Holy Roman Empire was caught up in other matters, and Adolf was left to defend the northern border with what he could muster. Valdemar crushed him, imprisoning Adolf in Hamburg. Adolf III died not long afterward, passing on his remaining title, Count of Schauenberg, to his eldest son, Adolf IV. Holstein and the little town of Hamburg had been lost to the Danes in what seemed to be the beginning of a grand expansion. Danish holdings now stretched into modern Germany and included lands around the Baltic Sea. Adolf IV began to plan to regain the lands that his father had lost and redeem his father's legacy. Adolf was probably in his late 20s when his father died. He began cautiously by investigating the conditions in occupied Germany. Things weren't going well. The citizens of Hamburg resented their Danish overlords. The men of Dithmarschen, a region northwest of Hamburg, were particularly unsatisfied. Adolf realized that he had support if he could convince anyone that he represented a real alternative to the rule of King Valdemar. For the next few years, Adolf gathered the allies that he could find, building his army of reconquest. Many of the men of Hamburg remembered Adolf's father and joined his force. When everything was ready, Adolf marched north, and Valdemar came south to meet him. Adolf was a young man in his 20s, and Valdemar II was a conqueror at the height of his power. Adolf was still trying to figure out how to exploit his one advantage, the dissatisfaction in Valdemar's conquered lands, when the two armies met in Bonhoefet in the north of modern Germany. The two armies met in the early morning on the feast of St. Mary Magdalene. They engaged at dawn, and initially, Adolf was happy with the way he had set up his battle lines. Then the sun rose, and he realized the trick played by the wily Danish king. Adolf had allowed his army to come at Valdemar from the west, which meant his men were now staring right into the rising sun. The sun blinded them as they fought, and Valdemar's forces surged forward. Adolf watched as he started to lose. Unsure what else to do, Adolf shouted out a public oath, witnessed by those around him. He swore that if he won this battle and redeemed the name of his father, he would build monasteries in these lands. Many generals had promised the same, but Adolf went further. Adolf was a young father, but he promised that if he won, he would set his life in order and leave the world behind to become a monk in one of his monasteries. With this oath made, Adolf urged his horse forward, and with a few loyal men, slammed into the front lines of King Valdemar. Adolf and his loyal men plunged into the midst of the Danish army. This could easily have been a suicide charge. But, as it happened, Adolf burst through the front ranks and found himself among the contingent from Dithmarschen. Seeing Adolf burst through the enemy lines, they decided that he must be doing well in the battle, and they rallied around him. Suddenly, Valdemar's army was being attacked from two sides. The Danes tried to orient themselves toward the new threat, and now they no longer had the advantage of the morning sun. The mighty Danish army crumbled. King Valdemar had been wounded in the fighting and had to be carried to safety by a single knight. The Danes had been humiliated. Valdemar would try to expand his empire a few more times, and Adolf would stop him. Soon, it became clear that the Danes had lost the momentum of expansion. Adolf set about restoring the world that his father had built. He gave the city of Hamburg back their privileges, serving as a protector, but not a direct ruler. Adolf and his wife poured money into the city. They built monasteries for the Dominicans and the Franciscans. The citizens of the new city were deeply grateful for this help. They showed it when they could, which was why, when Count Adolf arranged a marriage for his daughter, the citizens of Hamburg showed up with over-the-top gifts for the young bride that put everyone else to shame. Adolf had regained the lands lost by his father. He had reclaimed the family honor. His daughter had been married. His wife had proved open to his request to leave the world and live as a monk. She, too, had the growing sense of a religious vocation. Now, the important thing was that his departure from the world would not lead to chaos. Adolf knew that if he wanted his sons to rule after him, he would have to teach them to be rulers. Over the next years, Adolf concentrated on teaching what he knew to his growing boys. 10 years passed. Hamburg had several thriving religious communities. Adolf's sons were now young men, raised to command. Adolf looked around for a situation that would allow them to try their hands as rulers in semi-controlled circumstances. The answer, when it came, was obvious. He was going to redeem another part of his father's legacy. Adolf was going to go north on crusade. The years in which Adolf was regaining and restoring the lands of his father had been the great years of the Sword Brothers of Livonia. They had started as just a few knights employed by a bishop to protect his small flock, and grown into a fearsome, mid-tier military order. The Sword Brothers had largely succeeded in bringing peace to Livonia. But success brought challenges of its own. Yes, the Sword Brothers were holding back the pagans, but Sword Brother power was an inconvenience to other Christian factions. Maintaining knights and equipment cost money. When the Sword Brothers tried to levy tolls, their rivals seized on the outcry, and soon turned the Vatican against them. The Sword Brothers were unprepared for these political battles, and their funds were running out. The Grand Master of the Sword Brothers, Master Fulkwin, considered his situation and could only see two ways out. He tried the political solution first, attempting to negotiate a merger on equal terms with the more established Teutonic Order. When the merger fell through, Fulkwin's only other option was the dangerous one. If he was going to get new lands, he realized he would have to open a new front against the pagans of Lithuania. Fulkwin hesitated, but in the end, he had no other choice. Fulkwin was a careful enough warrior to realize that the tactical situation was less and less favorable to the Sword Brothers. When German knights had first encountered Livonian pagans, the pagans had been foolish enough to face them head-on. No one could withstand the charge of a medieval knight, and the pagans had lost badly. So they had adapted their tactics, staying in the woods and sniping from the trees. The Sword Brothers had adapted in turn, swapping lances for short spears they could swing around in the tangle of the forest, and starting to carry crossbows. They had learned to exploit the winter, marching their armies down frozen rivers and fighting in the snow. For a time, these changes had given the Sword Brothers an edge, especially since in theory Christian merchants would not supply weapons to pagans. But merchants had their own incentives, and soon pagans who could pay were as well armed as the Christians. The Lithuanians were wealthy and ready for a fight. Master Folkwind knew they would be a ferocious enemy. At first, things went well. The Livonian Rhymed Chronicle, written after these last days of the Sword Brothers, told the story. In their first attempt, the Sword Brothers faced a large Lithuanian army, and Folkwind told his men to fight with courage. Then the entire army, yearning for battle like a hungry falcon, cried, "Then let the speeches end, and let us begin the first exchange with swords and spears." 2,000 Lithuanians were cut to pieces and fell on the earth, and the rest tired of the fight and fled in all directions. God gave victory to his Christians, who happily turned homeward. Even in Holstein, Adolf must have gotten word of these great victories. Things had gone so well that soon the Sword Brothers were clamoring for an unusual summer campaign, and in 1236, Master Folkwind led them into Lithuania again. At first they had some success, but soon realized they were being shadowed by a Lithuanian army. In the winter wars, the knights could ride over the frozen rivers. Now they were pushed to the river and found it was swampy, the worst ground for a mounted warrior to fight on. Folkwind understood the tactical situation. They needed to attack and break out of the area immediately. As they came to a stream, they saw the enemy. Few of those who had been so bold in Riga now rushed into battle. The master rode up to the best of them and said, "Now is the time to fight. Your honor is at stake. If we attack them at once, then we can proceed freely home again." But few of the Sword Brothers saw the danger as clearly as Folkwind did, and they hesitated and delayed. Besides, there weren't that many Lithuanians. That night, the remainder of the Lithuanian force arrived, and the trap closed around the Sword Brother expedition. The rhymer, as we call the anonymous author of the Rhyming Chronicle, sadly finishes the story. They had to fight the pagans, even though they did not want to. In the swamp, they could offer but weak resistance, and they were cut down like women. I lament the deaths of the many heroes who were so easily slain. There was a sizable number who were so cowardly to flee homewards, but these were soon butchered. The master and his brothers put up a heroic defense until their horses were slain, and even then they fought on foot and felled many men before they were vanquished. Good Master Folkwind comforted his brothers well. 48 made this stand and were attacked repeatedly. Finally, and with great difficulty, the Lithuanians felled them with long spears. God rest their souls. They, along with many other crusaders, departed this life in glory. After the defeat, there weren't many Sword Brothers left in Livonia. Areas that had previously been pacified rose in revolt, and there was little the few remaining Sword Brothers could do about it. Instead, the mighty Teutonic Knights moved in, with full support from the Church. Their order had been looking for a new base of operations, and they were given the lands they could conquer and convert in Prussia to the west of Livonia. The last of the Sword Brothers would be absorbed into the Teutonic Order. Master Folkwind had hoped to merge with the Teutonic Order as an equal partner. Now that there were barely any Sword Brothers left, they were simply absorbed. the Sword Brothers had cared deeply about Livonia. But to the Teutonic Order, Livonia was a very low priority. Securing their home base in modern Prussia mattered to the Teutonic Order. The Mongol invasion that would shortly overrun Kiev and threaten the whole of Europe mattered to them. By comparison, the insurrection in Livonia was not really that important. And so by the time the Teutonic Order finally turned their attention to Livonia, the insurrection had dug in, and the fighting would go on for another 50 years. But in 1238, a year after the absorption of the Sword Brothers, Adolf IV decided to take his crusade into this chaotic, semi-abandoned state. We don't know what happened on Adolf's crusade, but it is hard to imagine that he did not provide welcome stability. Unlike many crusaders, Adolf didn't need someone to help him learn how to fight northerners. He had spent his whole life preparing to battle the Danes. Adolf likely inspired the remaining defenders of Livonia, shored up their defenses, and offered insights to the Teutonic garrisons on how to fight in the snow. Over the year that he was on crusade, Adolf kept up to date on the way his sons ruled in his place. He was pleased with the reports. And so, with his crusader oath fulfilled, Adolf turned homeward. It had been 12 years since he had sworn his oath, and he was ready to do what he had sworn, at last. Adolf IV returned home and formally handed his titles to his sons. He had his choice among monasteries. He chose the monastery dedicated to St. Mary Magdalene, the saint on whose feast day he had won his great victory against the Danes. The monks there were Franciscans, then often known as barefoot monks, since they lived in total poverty. And so it was that, in the year 1239, Count Adolf IV, conqueror and crusader, joined the other novices in the monastery at Hamburg as Brother Adolf. It was no easy thing to leave behind wealth and power and be a monk, but it seems that Brother Adolf took to his vocation with enthusiasm. The people of the growing city were shocked, and then became proud of the barefoot figure of the man who had once been a lord. It gradually occurred to the people of Hamburg that, despite his humble stature, Adolf was still leading them, although his example now pointed to something beyond this world. In 1244, Brother Adolf undertook a pilgrimage to Rome. He wanted to ask the Pope whether a man like him, a man who had spilled a lot of blood, could ever become a priest. Pope Innocent IV spoke to Brother Adolf and made a decision, beginning the process by making Adolf a subdeacon. Subdeacon Adolf walked barefoot back to Hamburg. Just before Christmas, in 1244, Adolf became a priest. Eventually, the Franciscan order moved him a little north to Kiel, where he would live the rest of his life as a friar. He died in 1261. Outside the monastery, the river of history flowed on. The city of Hamburg would thrive, becoming one of the great free cities of the north, a key part of the trade empire of the Hanseatic League. The border with Denmark would hold. The Teutonic Order would establish itself in Prussia, in time becoming a purely spiritual order, though many have thought that the warrior monks passed their iron determination on to the people of Prussia itself. And for a very long time, the people of Hamburg would keep the memory of Blessed Adolf IV, the man who shaped history and then left history behind for something more important. The city was still mulling over his example in the early 19th century, when they raised a monument to his memory and inscribed it with these words: "Through his victories he saved Germanness. With wise insight and generous restraint, he laid the foundations of the independence of our free city, that is, Hamburg, and seemed to the men of his time indeed, to the men of all times, great as a lord and a hero, but greater still as a Christian and as a man, in self-control and in true devotion to God.